so they could eat. And then they were able to walk back through the snow using the nourishment that they gained from that. On another occasion, Dudley was off working with cattle out near Las Vegas, and a lightning storm came up. Their horses were spooked, and he ended up again by himself with no horse and no food. And he had to walk all the way from Las Vegas to Santa Clara. By the time he got up through the desert and into the canyon, he was nearly dead because he had no nourishment. He laid down on a rock, and when he awoke, he was being cared for by an Indian. And the Indians gave him some tobacco to revive him, and then some wheat to suck on, and they nursed him back to health, and he was then able to walk on into Santa Clara. So he was a person who had gained their respect. He was not a person that had hostility toward them, and they knew it.
With the introduction of the Euro-American, as they came through this area again, that as they passed through, and then eventually with the Mormon community become more established, of course, water is the prime factor here in this area, which still is today, but they began to come down and to set up their iron and cotton missions. They established themselves on the water sources down here, and of course with that took away the Paiutes some of their water sources, and some of them were not real friendly by also building fence lines and fences to keep of course the Paiutes were the ones here to keep Paiutes out, and of course their animals and whatnot. And they also began to bring down a lot of the domesticated animals, the cattle, the sheep, the horses, and of course all these needed to be fed and watered. The Paiute people used the seeds off the grasses, also some of the roots. There's a lot of different plants that were out there and available, and nowadays they're not there. With this interference, so to speak, of the foodstuffs of the Paiutes themselves began to kill some of the cattle and utilize the food there, and in turn, one of the first mission presidents and stake presidents that was down there, Anthony Ivins, took it upon himself to both become a Indian agent along with his assignment as a stake president down there to establish a reservation for the Paiute people. So he did establish what is now currently the Shibwoots Reservation, and moved all of the Paiute people that were in that area over to the Shibwoots Reservation. Depopulation was one of the biggest factors with Indian tribes all across the country. Of course, in our area here with the Paiutes, it was not so much with the wars that took the population, but a lot of the diseases that were introduced to the Paiutes had no immunity, but also it affected the settlers. Many of the settlers also were plagued by some of the diseases that were out here in this area. So disease took probably a bigger portion of Paiute population in the early days. The other factor in depopulation in this particular area was the raids and kidnapping of Paiute women and children by the Utes and Navajos as they came through this area, and they were taken, but also they were sold as slaves to the Spanish, but also up in some of the other tribes. This factor is also a big concern for Paiutes as they try to get their population back up.
In 1861, when the Civil War was just beginning, Brigham Young saw the need to settle a place where they could raise cotton. He surveyed the state or the area and chose St. George. Because they were coming to raise cotton, it automatically took on the name Dixie, the Dixie of Utah, Utah's Dixie. Brigham Young also was seeking a corridor to protect the area from attack some distance from Salt Lake City. Cotton was an important product because of the making of cloth. With the Civil War starting, the Southerners weren't raising cotton for export. Brigham Young's desire was to raise their own, be self-sufficient. It was natural to come here. The climate was a place that would sustain the growth of cotton. Cotton requires a lot of heat, a lot of moisture. St. George had the river and they had the heat, so this was a natural place. In October of 1861, Brigham Young stood in the tabernacle or stood in the meeting house and called families to move from where they were living to St. George. That must have been a shock. To go to conference thinking you're going to be spiritually fed, only to find out that you're being told you'll be moving soon. That was a trial for a lot of those pioneers. As they sat and listened to the names being called and instructed to depart as soon as possible, before the month was out, the group had been organized. Erastus Snow was the leader. They were told they were coming. They sold what they could, left what they couldn't sell, and started south, not knowing for sure what the new home held for them. Santa Clara was settled. Washington was settled. By settled, I mean they had a few settlers living in them as early as 1855. And this was 1861, so there had been a little awareness of what was going on, but they didn't realize how hot can be. The people who were called were not necessarily from a geographic area, although there were several Southerners with cotton raising experience. They were people who had certain talents. They would be maybe a blacksmith or a doctor, or different talents, so the town would be a complete town. The name of St. George comes basically from George A. Smith. George A. Smith had helped Brigham select the people who should come down here. He was in charge of southern Utah, settled Parowan, had been down here many times. When Brigham called the people to come to Dixie, he named it St. George. There's some people who say, well, Philip St. George Cook was a Mormon battalion leader, or in England or in the British Isles there was St. George as a common name, but all the evidence we can find suggests it was named by Brigham for George A. Smith. Each mission had its own hardship. Every one was different than the other. Dixie was hot, hotter than anyone knew it could be. They arrived in December, and for the first year they were trying to build a home, trying to plant a garden, trying to survive, really. They were ill prepared for the heat. They had no idea what 110 degrees meant, or what the warm water or the lack of water meant. How do you go to sleep at night in that kind of heat? That was a challenge that none of them were prepared for.
Erastus Fairbanks Snow and Orson Pratt were originally called to lead this effort down here. Orson left after about 3 years for another assignment, but Erastus was very heavily involved for those 18 years. He returned from a mission in St. Louis in September of 1861 and was just getting settled in with his family when he received a call to head up the mission to St. George in October conference of 1861, which was about a month after he returned from his mission to St. Louis. Now, of course, prior to that time, there had been settlements in Washington and Santa Clara and up the Virgin River in the Grafton area. But these had been settlements that had struggled, and Brigham Young really wanted to reinforce the effort here in southwestern Utah. Interestingly enough, it's almost incomprehensible now to imagine the effort that must have gone into preparing for that journey to come here to St. George from Salt Lake. But the first group of this large group of settlers arrived here November 25th, really less than 2 months after the call was originally extended in the Salt Lake Tabernacle.
Keeping water in the Virgin River was one of the biggest things. It was the biggest problem for people as they lived here, because without water they couldn't raise crops. Without crops they couldn't live. I think they probably built dams to the tune of about 70 or more in those first 35 years. It was a constant struggle to keep a dam in the water and provide water for the crops. It was difficult for everyone, but I think it was very difficult for women. In fact, a number of the statistics indicate that more women died in southern Utah than other young women of their same age any place on the frontier. And a couple of reasons for that would be the drought, so lack of food. So the women would have poor nutrition, because what food they had, they would feed their children and their husbands. They knew that without the husbands working in the farm, that they wouldn't be able to survive. So many of the women were malnutritioned. And of course they had lower immune systems because of the poor nutrition. So they had more disease than normal. Malaria, diphtheria, and then also most of the women had a baby about every 2 years. Most women had at least 9 babies, and many of those children died. They had magnificent midwives. Many of them had been trained in their native countries. Many of them learned from other women. Dr. Meeks, Pretty Meeks, his Bible, so to speak, was the Thompsonian health guide. And it had a lot of homemade recipes. Many of them were made of herbs. And almost every garden in southern Utah grew herbs because they were used extensively for medicinal purposes. There are many wonderful midwife stories. One of my favorites is about Alice Isom. She was a midwife in Hurricane and La Verkin, around in that area. And a very compassionate one, of course, like they all were. But she charged a sack of flour if the man was there when the baby was born. If the man wasn't there, then she charged $5. And $5 was very hard to come by. Nobody had any money. And somebody said, well, why do you charge $5 if the man isn't there? And she said, well, he was there in the beginning, he should be there at the end. I liked her a lot. A woman's daily routine was very difficult. Remember that she couldn't go to a store and purchase anything that she needed. And remember that she'd lived here for a period of time, so the things that she brought with her, she no longer had. She had to make her own soap. She had to make her own butter, which means that she had to milk the cow and churn the butter. She had to make her own clothing. Often she would have a few sheep or would have been growing cotton, which meant that she would have to card and spin and actually make her own thread, and then either weave it or have someone else weave it. Many of the women were excellent weavers and would do weaving and then exchange for something that another woman had. They would dye their clothing. The women, of course, would have to cook, which meant they had to have a fire all the time, even in the summer. I can't even imagine how difficult it had to be for them to cook in the summer and provide for their families. The heat had to be stifling, and there was no place you could get away from it. Many of the women had a lot of faith, and they prayed a lot, certainly. And I think they were often given promptings of how to survive and how to help